Grace and peace. I'm Brian Muster, the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our lives, and the power of the Holy Spirit to change our world. We are continuing our series on Genesis 1 through 11, the meaning of creation. Where does humanity belong? This is the 7th lesson out of 10 in this series. Can it get worse? We looked last week at the fall of humanity and the introduction of sin into creation. This week we're looking at Cain and Abel and the outcome of all that, and yes, it can get worse. This is the 4th video in this series titled A New Hope, and we're going to look at the last couple sentences in chapter 4 with as it creates and just redirects this narrative, giving us hope at the end. And Adam knew his wife again. She bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. So to Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So we see here this repeated idea in Genesis 4. Adam knew his wife. Cain and Abel came. Cain knew his wife, having kids. Now Adam knew his wife again, coming, and Seth comes out of that. So this idea of be fruitful and multiply is one of the themes of Genesis 4, but it's also balanced with the fact that murder and death is now a stark contrast to what God has given or what God has commanded or what God has blessed humanity with, this idea of being fruitful and multiply. So we're going to make a whole bunch of other humans, but we're also going to destroy, damage, and kill those humans as well. So it's kind of this balance between being fruitful and multiplying and death and murder. Just that sort of, that's what this chapter is about. Now, this has what's called an inclusio. The Hebrew Old Testament did not use punctuation or paragraphs, so inclusios are often used to set apart sections. An inclusio is when similar wording and ideas are found at the beginning and the end of a section. So this is kind of sets off chapter 4 as its own entire section. We saw one of these kind of going from Genesis 1:1 and then Genesis 2:1 through 4 had very similar wording in it, so that you could tell that that was all one section. Chapter 4 does the same thing. Let's look at some of these things. It starts off, now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, called his name Seth, for she said. So very similar language there. And then 4:3, in the course of time Cain brought to the Lord an offering. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So seeing worship in both those sets, seeing reproduction in both sets, and then also the description of a son's name, and then also worship in both sets. That kind of sets this apart and makes this, gives us the signal without punctuation and paragraphs and outline sort of stuff. This is one of the ways that the author of Genesis intended to clue us in on the idea that this section was one section that should be kind of looked at as a whole. Now this brings up this idea, and we hear Eve talk about this. Cain, it could have been the offspring from 3:15, that offspring that would rise up and defeat the offspring of the serpent, but he was disqualified by the sin of murder. Abel could have been the one, but he was murdered. So Seth now is the one who keeps this hope of life. This idea of be fruitful and multiply is now dependent upon Seth. This idea in 3:15 that the offspring of the woman will rise up and defeat the serpent is now dependent upon Seth as well. Abel has been killed and Cain has been disqualified. So Seth is now the one who bears this idea of keeping the seed alive and this idea of moving the offspring forward. And that is a continuous theme throughout the book of Genesis. And actually, in fact, the Old Testament is who is going to be, where will the offspring come from, who is next, will the seed continue, and there's all these other pieces to it that are trying to fight against the seed continuing as well. Now, Eve's words, how she describes the name of her son, is very interesting, comparing the beginning of the chapter to the end. The author of Genesis records two statements by Eve in a way that encourages us to compare them. I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord is very different in tone when compared to God has appointed for me another offspring. Commenters hint that maybe the first statement by Eve was intentionally designed to diminish the role of God when compared to the second statement. And they see the second statement as a humble response to God's blessing. So, although reading it by itself, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord, might mean that, it can be interpreted multiple ways. But at the end of the chapter, God has appointed for me another offspring. God is first. God is the one doing all the action. God is gifting this child, whereas Eve in the first one, she seems to be doing the most of the work, and God has helped her in some way, but not necessarily been the prime mover in that idea as well. So there's some interpretation that goes on there, and commentators might make more of this than it is, but there seems to be a difference in Eve from the beginning of this chapter to the end of the chapter, and how she looks at that. So just some discussion questions. One, do you think the author of Genesis wants us to see a change in Eve based on her statements in chapter 4? If yes, what kind of change would that be? And how would you connect it to chapters 2 and 3? As always, chapter 4, as we've shown several times, is written so that with very similar language to chapters 2 and 3 and even 1, so that we're always thinking about what has happened. How would we connect Eve's statements about her childbearing, about the names of her children, in 2 and 3, and what would that possibly mean about this? Chapter 4 ends, at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. What is this verse talking about, and how is it still true to this day? So we saw Genesis 1, 2, and even 3. Most of the conversations all of the conversations between God and humanity are always initiated by God. Now in chapter 4, we see humanity now is reaching out to God, calling on the name of the Lord, offering things to the Lord. Instead of God initiating, humanity is initiating. There's a lot there. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is that a result of the fall? Is that a result of the damaged relationship he got? What are some of the possible dangers in the fact that even the worship of God is now initiated by humanity? Does that open up the door for us to get it wrong, like Cain did? So these are some fascinating questions. We'd love to hear your comments about that and the discussion in the comment sections below. As always, I enjoyed having this conversation with you. There are 3 ways to join the conversation in person: Sunday nights at 5 p.m. and the JEMIC live Monday night 7 p.m. via Zoom. These weekly wrap-ups on YouTube or WordPress. I'm all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, WordPress, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow. I enjoyed having this conversation with you. Hopefully it continues real soon.